On the 15th of April 1945, as the Second World War was coming to an end inside of Europe, the British 11th Armoured Division arrived at Bergen-Belsen Concentration Camp. Nothing had prepared them for what they would find within the barbed wire fences. In the months before, thousands of concentration camp prisoners had been sent from different camps such as Auschwitz, and a camp which was meant to hold a fraction of the people became incredibly overcrowded. Dysentery, typhus and other diseases spread through Belsen like wildfire, and it's believed that more than 35,000 people had died in the first months of 1945. There was horror and terror everywhere, and those who liberated the camp were horrifically scarred by the sights that greeted them that day. There were emaciated skeletons walking around barely alive, and amongst the close to dead were around 13,000 corpses lying all around the site unburied, as the SS guards had refused to do this. Many of them had taken off, but some such as Irma Grazer, Josef Kramer and Herta Bofer were arrested for their evil actions. But the clean-up operation that came next was huge, and the British oversaw the interring of the dead of Belsen into huge mass graves. In this video, we will look at what happened to the bodies of the prisoners of Belsen, and look at how the Allies managed to clean up the horrific site. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Bergen-Belsen had been agreed to be surrendered to the Allies without a fight, and this order had come straight from Heinrich Himmler. He had ordered the SS guards to ensure that the prisoners, who were still alive, would try and bury the dead as best as they could, but there were too many corpses and the prisoners were too weak to do the job. As the British and Canadian soldiers entered Belsen, they discovered, as mentioned, 13,000 unburied bodies and roughly 60,000 prisoners, many of whom were starving and many of whom were infected with diseases such as typhus. The clean-up operation became very dangerous, and the prisoners had no hot food or water for days. Prisoners were dying at a rate of around 500 a day because of mostly typhus that was causing chaos. One BBC reporter who entered Belsen stated about what he saw. He claimed, "Here over an acre of ground lay dead and dying people. You could not see which was which. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do, with no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. Babies have been born here, tiny things that could not live. A mother driven mad screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child, and thrust a tiny mite into his arms and then ran off, crying terribly. This day at Belsen was the most horrible of my life." Now there were not enough Allied soldiers to deal with the corpses effectively. The British got to work providing medical care, and the surviving prisoners were deloused and were later moved to a different site. But hiding amongst the prisoners were a number of the former female guards of Bergen-Belsen, including Irma Grazer, Herta Bofer, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and many male guards and members of staff, including Dr. Fritz Klein and Senior Overseer Franz Hörsler. These men and women were then ordered at gunpoint to help the liberators deal with the corpses that lay all around. Large bulldozers were brought in to help dig mass graves that were scattered around the camp. There were in total 14 mass graves dug, and these contained the remains of at least 23,200 former prisoners of the camp. 2 of these graves had been established by the camp's administration and former Commandant Josef Kramer, the Beast of Belsen, to deal with the large numbers of inmates dying in early 1945 from disease, as the camp's crematoria, a small building, could not cope with the amount of deaths. One liberator of the camp described the chaos, and he stated, "And then on the left-hand side there were huts, and of course outside the huts were piles and piles of dead bodies, and living ones. We didn't know which were which. In the huts themselves equally, you didn't know who was dead and who was alive, unless there was some movement that you could see. Because the dead and the living were all together, they hadn't the energy to take the dead out, and there were so many piled outside, as I say, it was hard to see, to pick out the dead from the living." Some mass graves were dug by the former guards, and they were ordered to do this at gunpoint. They were given starvation rations as punishment, and were not allowed to use gloves, protective clothing, and did actually contract typhus from the bodies and corpses. The British screamed and screeched at the former guards to continue to work in burying the dead, and they didn't allow them much rest at all. For the British, these staff members of Belsen were the worst of the worst, and they were the cause of this, them being so devoted to their Nazi beliefs that they wanted to exterminate so many people. The corpses were in such a bad way that when the guards lifted them up to take them to the graves, the huge pits which were dug, that the arms and legs were so rotten that they tore off the torso. Former Liberated soldier Harry Oakes claimed about the SS Guards' work that, of course, then the SS Guards were put to work burying the dead. They were made to. They got a lorry, and they had to start this lorry without using the self-starter in the morning and physically pick up the dead. They were everywhere in piles around the camp, in the huts. Soon they had to dig more graves, huge graves. The mass graves were long, huge pits, and they were very deep. They had dirt and earth piled at the side of the pits, and the bodies were brought over on the back of trucks, and some were even unceremoniously pushed into the grave by bulldozers. The guards were told to carry the body over to the edge of the pit, then they were thrown in, this being the fastest way of dealing with the bodies, rather than the most respectful. For the Allied liberators, the corpses caused many problems, and they were disease-ridden, and there was a real concern that the corpses would lead to further prisoners getting sick, or even the liberators catching the disease of typhus. Within 2 months of liberation, there were actually 17 former guards and members of staff at Belsen who died of typhus due to the fact that they were forced to handle the corpses with no protection or protective clothing. One man who died because of this was the actual boyfriend of infamous female guard Irma Grazer, Franz Hatzinger. After his death, he was buried inside of a nearby military cemetery. There was also some who took their lives knowing that a war crimes trial would be on the horizon for them, and there were 3 former members of staff who were shot by the British for the fact they tried to escape during the clean-up. Regarding the bulldozer that shockingly pushed the bodies into the pit, this was used allegedly upon 2 occasions, as the bodies that were being dealt with at the time were so badly decomposed that they couldn't be handled, and they were pushed into the grave to prevent further maiming of the remains. The sites of the graves were marked by a marker that told of how many people were approximately buried in there, and when they were interred. For example, grave number 11 shows that 2,500 were buried on the 12th of May 1945, roughly a month after liberation, showing how long the clean-up operation took. Mass grave number 1 held 1,000 bodies, but the need for deeper and larger pits was required, and mass grave number 2 held 5,000 dead bodies. Inside of this grave there were images of many female guards who were sorting through the remains, who were ordered to climb into the pit to sort out the bodies and move the ones on the side of the pit into the middle to make more space. They were ordered to tread on the corpses to do this, and the British forced them to do this at gunpoint. The graves were blessed and a service was conducted over the mass grave by British Army chaplains. Mass grave 3 was also very large, with 5,000 corpses interred there. The bodies here were brought on trucks, and the male guards were ordered to take them off the trucks, and they then were to throw them inside of the pit. There are some very infamous images captured here, showing the guards in front of the remains, and the former camp doctor, Fritz Klein, stood amongst the corpses, with thousands surrounding him. The other graves which were dug were not as big as these 2 pits, and there were many graves focused around the existing command buildings at the site. Some were also dug on the outskirts of the camp. After the clean-up operation was complete, the British then took flame-throwing Bren gun carriers to the camp, along with Churchill crocodile tanks, which burned the site to the ground to eradicate the typhus and louse infestation that prevented further spread of the disease. The British also tried their best to save many of the former prisoners, and senior medical officers instigated plans to deal with the sick prisoners of Belsen. They tried their hardest, but around 9,000 people died in April following liberation, and a further 4,000 prisoners had died within the next few months, meaning that over 13,000 people died following the liberation of Belsen. Specialist teams were even sent from Britain to deal with the starving problem. It took over a month for all the corpses that were lying around the camp to be interred inside of mass graves, and those who died following liberation were also buried. The sight that greeted those men who liberated the camp remained with them for the rest of their lives, and they were horrified by what they saw. The soldiers were not trained for this sort of clean-up. Many were very battle-hardened, but they were broken by the sheer scale of slaughter inside of Bergen-Belsen. The bodies were buried inside of mass graves, and today these are marked by memorials. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.